See people trickling in. Welcome, everyone. Just wait 1 or 2 more minutes. All right, and I'll get started. So welcome everyone to Preservation North Carolina Shelter Series. I'm Julianne Patterson and I'm PNC's Outreach Manager. Our shelter series is virtual programming that allows us to connect with preservationists across the state on a variety of topics. We aim for 1 virtual event a month, and we have a full schedule planned for the year, which you can see on our website, along with recordings of past programs. We cover a variety of preservation related topics, and each program is different. However, several of our upcoming programs, including this program and one that we just did last month, focus on stories and themes that relate to a traveling exhibit we just debuted called We Built This, which is profiles and stories of Black architects and builders in North Carolina. The exhibit just left Raleigh and it's heading, it'll next be in Charlotte at the historic Rosedale. It'll start there at the beginning of next month and be there till June. And then it's traveling all the way into towards the end of 2023 already. So you can find out more information about the exhibit and future events on our website, which is preservationnc.org. The shelter series has always been free of charge, and we hope to keep it that way. But I wanted to extend a huge thank you to anyone who added a donation to their registration today. It's greatly appreciated, and it helps us keep these programs and the work that we do possible and going. Because this is a webinar, we can't see or hear you, but I still want to answer all of your questions. So please ask your questions at any time during this presentation using the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'll moderate all questions at the end of the presentation, but if we don't get to your question, I'll try to follow up with you directly via email and direct your question to the person that it's meant for. We have your email address through the Eventbrite registration, so if there are questions that we don't get to, I will do my best to follow up with you. If you have any technical issues throughout the program, please let me know in the little chat box and I'll do my best to help you. So today we're lucky to have a full panel of presenters to talk to us about African American cemeteries at the local, regional, state, and even the national level. So first, Melissa Timo works for the NC Office of State Archaeology, and she's the Historic Cemetery Specialist. She received her MA in Historical Archaeology with an emphasis in Public Archaeology from the University of West Florida in Pensacola, Florida in 2013. Before coming to OSA, Melissa worked for a variety of archaeology jobs, but she has a passion for connecting people to their local history, historic cemeteries, and archaeological resources. Shawn Patch is a senior archaeologist in the Greensboro NC Office of New South Associates Incorporated. He's been working with cemeteries of all types for the past 22 years and has an extensive experience with mapping, grave marker inventory, and ground penetrating radar surveys to identify unmarked graves. He's written dozens of technical reports, given presentations at professional conferences, and published in academic journals. Debra Taylor Gonzalez is a passionate and experienced genealogist who has worked on her family's genealogy for over 30 years. As president of the Friends of Gear Cemetery, she's been instrumental in the reformation of the organization since 2019 and has researched several people within the cemetery. Debra's a member of several genealogical societies and has been involved with organizing an African American Cemetery Coalition to unite other groups with the same mission. Which brings me to our final speaker, who's not on the Zoom yet, but will be joining us later. And that's Christopher DeVore. So Chris is the legislative director for Congresswoman Alma Adams, and he'll be joining us later to give an update on the African American Burial Grounds Preservation Act. So with that, I will hand things over to Melissa to get us started.
All right, do you see my
We see it in, we do. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I'm going to tell you. For everyone who's joining us, we were all joking before this that you can go through an entire presentation and somebody might not ever let you know that they're seeing the wrong view. So I promised everyone that I would let them know if we were seeing the wrong view. So I think what you have to do is the screen that you're sharing from the Zoom preference needs to just be your PowerPoint.
It froze on me, so I'm going to try to start from again. How about now?
Perfect.
Awesome. All right. So yes, Melissa Timo, OSA. I've been with the Office of State Archaeology since 2019. So what I'm going to talk about to sort of get us kicked off, get this all started, is I'll talk a little bit about the sort of unique and special characteristics of African American cemeteries that we've see across the state, and look a little bit about where we find them on the landscape, what kind of things are in them that make sort of help you identify them as being from a particular community and not just a stereotypical cemetery. And then I'll tell you a little bit about what the state is doing, and some of the things that we're working on to have more of these cemeteries identified and recorded and kept in memory for as long as we can. No. There we go. All right. So first we'll talk about location, because if we think about a cemetery, we often think about a lovely hill overlooking a grand view, or in a community center. And that wasn't necessarily the case for many African American communities, especially before emancipation. And so where will we find these resources, especially as we learn that they're not as well marked or well identified, especially into the 21st century? Well, there are certain trends that we do see in the Southeast and into the Caribbean that might help us. But I do have to say, and we'll see more in other presentations that come up later, there are unique expressions of what an African American, especially a pre-emancipation African American cemetery, look like across different sections of the state. But here are some trends to help us. And the first is that many of these communities did not have the liberty to choose where the location of the enslaved community cemetery would be placed on the landscape. And so we often see these put on sort of marginal or out of the way, unusable, unprofitable land. And so you see them tucked out of the way, sometimes in not great places, or attached to the backside of a Euro-American cemetery or Euro-American church cemetery, sort of out of sight, out of mind sort of feel to them. And this location can be seen all over, like I said, the New World. You can see a very famous example from the National Park Service, the African Burial Ground National Monument in New York City. This was an enormous pre-emancipation cemetery. And then you can see in the red line, this cemetery is literally located outside the city walls. So it was, completely out of sight. This is also a super cool site. So if you have a chance to at least visit the website, I strongly encourage you to do so. This is a really great project where the descendant community and the local African American community had a very strong voice in how the story was told. On a local level, we talk about this cemetery that was deemed by its descendants as the slave cemetery at Clearview Plantation. Shawn's group actually helped us out with this one. They did the survey work. This also follows the pattern. We see the arrow at the top there is pointing towards a house and a sort of business center for the plantation. The arrow with the green island down there is likely some sort of a farm outbuilding, and the yellow circle is the cemetery. So we can see, again, tucked out of the way, but that kind of looks like it's in an open field, and that wouldn't make any sense because an open field is something that you can plow. But there is a landform that sweeps around this way that's sort of like a drop off. So therefore, this is no longer a useful thing because you can't really plow over it. So we also see it fitting this mold. After emancipation, we do see into the 1870s, sometimes a little bit longer, these enslaved community cemeteries continue to be reused. whether because they want to, because that's where their family is, or because of a need. Many of the African American churches did not form until the 1870s in parts of North Carolina. Then as we move forward in time, we do see new patterns that are also boundaries. Sometimes the boundaries between the white neighborhood and the Black neighborhood, like you can see in Mount Hope, tucked onto the edge, like Fitzgerald Cemetery in Durham, but also as a community center, like we can see here in Olive Hill Cemetery in Morganton. This cemetery is next to the high school, and behind, if you were taking this picture like I was, behind you was a furniture factory. So this is where people lived, where they worked, where they went to school. So a community hub with their former community members brought into the same story. Now, markers do change over time. If they did have markers that survived, most of them that we see are field stones, especially if you're in the Piedmont area. Field stones weren't necessarily shaped, and they not necessarily inscribed, but we see them because they were convenient, they were at hand, and they were able to mark something sort of permanently. But this wasn't necessarily a scene all over the state. And we do see lots of other things that were used to mark graves. Some of them include, and they weren't just used in enslaved community cemeteries. Those cemeteries where the enslaved community was put behind a white cemetery or church cemetery, we also see them employed there. We do see lots of other types of markers, some of which weren't very permanent. Wood markers, whether they just be posts. We see a lot of pine stakes that were used to mark graves all across North Carolina. However, these wooden artifacts don't survive. There's a survivor bias because they're made of wood, and we live in North Carolina, and North Carolina has sort of a more acidic soil, which isn't very kind to wood. Sometimes there are shaped markers like these here that kind of look like people. These also don't survive very well, but they do have a tie straight back to older practices, especially from Central and West Africa, like you can see here from Ethiopia. These sort of people shapes mimic ancestor altars in this part of that continent, which is a kind of a cool continuation of tradition from somewhere that they were now forcefully disconnected from. We also see lots of handmade markers, and personally, these are my favorite because you can see, despite the fact that they may not have had funds to purchase a lofty granite marker, memory still persists. Traditions of memorialization continue, and they may be something like poured concrete with actual words written on it or other materials to spell out things, but they might just be other materials such as cinder blocks, things like these. You can sort of tell they are stone posts that were made of a local brownstone. So they were used for other things, but they were adapted by this community, some of which in that Sanford Cemetery have initials carved on them, some are left plain. But either way, they do stand out on the landscape if you're standing there as a purposefully constructed marker. We also see, as we move into the 20th century, especially, we do see formal markers being used. And this is a trend that I would like to investigate. This style of headstone was sort of the half round and ivy, with either ivy just by itself, ivy with a dove, or ivy with an anchor. I have seen all over the Piedmont, especially with that particular, usually concrete with that particular font. I want to know where it comes from, because if I'm seeing it all over the place, that means that somebody has to be making this. This isn't being made by your Uncle Joe in his backyard. So this is a project I'd like to see if so many of our communities have been using this, where tracking these purchases and these social networks across the, at least from the Piedmont into the southeastern coast that I've seen these, figure out what's happening there. We also see in African American cemeteries the use of funeral home tag markers as permanent markers. We see those all the time. They're designed by funeral homes as a temporary marker that can be replaced later. They usually are metal of some sort with a glass or a plastic cover over an index card of sorts with the information on it. But we see a lot of times in African American cemeteries, whether because they're good enough or because this is what making do, that they last, that they become the permanent marker, sometimes being adapted into something more permanent like concrete, like you can see in the sort of lower right-hand picture there for Maid Cemetery. We also see material goods, artifacts. Now this varies widely depending on the ability of the community to express themselves and where they are in the state. But we do see some traditions across the areas where African Americans and African folk have been enslaved. The use of these items sort of, again, harkens back to traditions from their home communities in Africa, in Central and West Africa especially. These artifacts are either tied to the person themselves and things that they were into, or their medicine bottle or things like that, or it was tied to religious or sort of cosmologies about the afterlife. Lots of water symbols you see. We see things that carry water or things that look like water, because in some traditions, the afterlife is under river bottoms, or this guiding the spirit back across the water to Africa. And so we see a lot of these items tied with that, like that little dog cup in that particular cemetery. That was the only dog motif that I found on any of the ceramics in that cemetery. So that had to have been somebody's favorite. But by using these artifacts, which are sort of temporary, that can get swished around, we do have some things that come up from that. On the good side, and especially an enslaved community cemetery, can never be said to be full, because you can shift things around and there's always room for one more person, which, you know, you don't have maybe a name for the individuals, but you can take comfort in the fact that everyone is together in one place after they've passed on. But the other hand, we have a real problem with these things surviving, because if you look at these pictures, and they're all from South Carolina, it kind of just looks like a debris field. And so people either pick it up, call it junk, haul it off to the side. And so those things are no longer marking. But I do want to tell you that artifacts like this are protected under North Carolina general statutes, because they act like memorials. So if you're ever in a cemetery and you want to be sure, is this a garbage or is this a memorial artifact, you'll be able to find my contact information, send me an email with the picture, and I'm happy to give you my opinion. We also, fitting in with that sort of water theme, we see a lot of use of shell, mostly, however, on the coastal areas. And that kind of makes sense for a couple reasons. One, access. Two, the Gullah Geechee corridor, the Gullah Geechee people, their corridor, their influence sort of stretches all the way up, halfway up the North Carolina coast, at least. So we see a lot of that feel that you see all the way down through South Carolina and Georgia and into North Florida, this sort of culture employed in North Carolina as well. However, you see the picture on the left-hand side, but that's in Sanford, the big old whelk shell. So that has me ask questions about, who is that person? Did they come from the coast? Do they have a Gullah history or a Gullah ancestry? Does someone in their family do that, to have that as part of their cemetery practice? Because I didn't see another shell in that cemetery. So that, even though we don't have that person's name, we have a clue about who they are and what they believed in. This is from the recently added to the National Register cemetery, the John N. Smith Cemetery in Southport, North Carolina. This is an amazing cemetery that is the heart of a Gullah Geechee community, and graves like this are replenished and refreshed, the shells, every year. And so it's a really cool living tradition that I've only seen in some places as artifacts and long since given over favor. So if you're in Southport, this is an awesome cemetery. These goods, speaking of the ongoing traditions, do change over time. And we see this. This is one particular example from my master's thesis work. We see the shell, there was glass, like the blue glass you see above it, all over this cemetery. Lots of cool old traditions, but it's an area where eventually everyone moved down to the coast because that's where the jobs were. And I visited the cemeteries where their Willie's descendants were. And instead of having things that are water or reflect light like water, only the African American members of the community used the solar power garden lights. Instead of having actual shells, there were a lot of shell motifs in the vessels that held flowers or what have you. And instead of glass, there were a lot of graves that were outlined in those flat forest pebbles that you put in vases in a very symbolic blue and white color combination. So it may not mean that these people believed in West African and Central African religious practice, but it's an aesthetic that it's just what you do. And we see it manifest in really cool ways. Other things you should look for are variations in ground cover for non-native vegetation, lots of periwinkle. We also see yucca used a lot in certain parts. Some of these, for example, I've seen some places, maybe not necessarily North Carolina, but African or weeping love grass was employed, not because it means anything, but because it came as seeds with them from Africa. So it's a little bit of home in this foreign place that you're being kept forcefully. The Office of State Archaeology Cemetery Program, it has trying to identify these things because there are very cool stories to be found, stories that haven't really been told all that much. And so our goal as a program is twofold. In general, one of them is to identify and record all cemeteries, but especially cemeteries whose stories haven't been told, like African American and Native American cemeteries. We also are here to assist folks in all of their cemetery questions. Most people don't think about the weird things that I think about, things about access and connecting with professionals like Shawn, developing partnerships and community groups like Debra has. These are not normal topics of thought for people. So we're here to help make connections and share with you the statutes that protect these places and allow you to have access, best practices, how to hire people, how to have skills to take care of these places. And we do offer a lot of resources. We're updating our website as we speak, where a lot of resources will be available, or links to other places that have fantastic resources, because there's a lot of places that are doing a lot of great things that are free to borrow from. So for right now, you can see the website is www.archaeology.ncdcr.gov/program/cemeteries. We also have this thing called the site file. The site file is a registry of archaeology sites, some historic structures, and historic cemeteries. It's just a list, but it's a list that goes with a map. And you can see the map over there. These are not all of the sites that exist in the entire state. These are just the ones that have been reported to us. And if you see, some of these are in lots of lovely straight lines, and that's not because people necessarily lived in those lines, but that's where North Carolina highways are, and lots of federal and state legislation requires archaeology be done before certain projects are undertaken. And that's part of the reasons why groups like Shawn's exist, is to help make sure we study these resources and learn as much as we can about them. So we have these forms. We have many different forms, but one's appropriate for right now is the Citizen Cemetery Reporting Form. And this is something that anybody can fill out about any cemetery. And it doesn't have to have all of the information filled out. The most important thing we ask you to focus on is getting a good location, because you can see we have lots of flags on the map. Some of those are cemeteries, some of those are archaeological sites, and the flag is important to help us protect the site, because we can't tell somebody to avoid putting X, Y, or Z on that construction project if we don't know the cemetery is there. So, but otherwise, this form asks for a name or multiple names. Many cemeteries have many names. We also look for, I'll show you more in a minute. Like I said, before development. Also, when I have grants come across my desk, I look in the area where the grants are applicable, and I'll shoot people emails if I find that you are applicable for that particular grant. Any cemetery that was established at least 50 years ago cannot be added to the registry, and it doesn't have to be on public lands. It can be on private property as well. So going back to the form, we can talk about who owned or who primarily used it, how maintained it is, what kind of markers are there or not there. We can talk about what community was associated with it, if it's enclosed or if there are any buildings, and if it's threatened. Is something going to be built there? Are there cows wandering around? Are there dirt bikes going through? Or is it just being left quietly by itself in the woods somewhere, being overgrown by brambles? All of these things can be added. We also have a template for adding markers and their condition, but we also accept all kinds of stuff. We will take anything that helps us understand the story. A lot of times cemeteries don't get books written about them, so the only official record may be this site form. So feel free to add family stories, photographs, death certificates, anything that tells us the history of these places. And it is important because this is a step moving forward in order to get these places additional recognition. Getting cemeteries on the National Register is a tricky ordeal. Cemeteries are kind of a gray area as far as listing goes, but it is possible, especially because a lot of African American cemeteries are the sole remaining resource from a community that doesn't have a standing structure anymore, whether that because of vandalism or lack of funding, or just the sheer having to use it. And it's not pristine anymore because it used to be a whole house and now it's a divided into 4 apartments. A lot of the African American resources don't hold the integrity that the National Register likes. But cemeteries are a great storytelling point for a community. So I would encourage people to look at the possibility. We do have state staff that can help you with the process. About 2% of the National Register listings are devoted to African American communities. So there is a focus now on this ethnic history, is what they're calling it. And I think that's where we'll be able to slide in more resources like African American cemeteries in the future. There are lots of great resources, as well as those 2 bulletins from the National Register to help you complete and figure out the best way forward if you do care to go that way. If not, then you can contact me. Like I said, I can contact folk that can walk you through that process. Beyond that, that's my contact information on the screen now. We also have a Facebook page where we will list additional workshops and other fun cemetery website and activity things that we'll be having. There's our website, and if you want to go above my head, because sometimes people do, State Archaeologist John Mintz there will be happy to answer questions as well.
Thank you, Melissa. Excuse me. And for everyone, I did include Melissa's email address in the follow-up email that you will receive. And I just copy and pasted all of the links to additional resources that she included on the last slide of her presentation in the chat. So if you want to access those, they're right there. Next up, we have Shawn.
All right. Thank you, Julianne. Thank you, Melissa. I learned a lot listening to you as always. So I will do my best to follow what you've said. Bear with me for a moment. Okay, can you see my notes, Julianne? Good, I'm in the right mode then, except I've not started at the beginning. Okay, am I at the front now? All right, well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. It's a great privilege and honor to be able to talk about some of the research I've done. It's not only about me, but I'm privileged to share this today. I'll be talking about cemeteries of enslaved communities in Granville County. I have 2 case studies that I'll focus on. I'll start by just providing a quick research context, and a lot of what you'll hear me talk about, you've already heard Melissa talk about, and hopefully I can reinforce some of the points that she made by focusing on a couple of specific examples. But cemeteries are one way of understanding the African American communities in the antebellum period. As Melissa alluded to, there are not many property types left from that period that are associated with those individuals, and we don't have a lot of written records from that time period. Burial patterns of African Americans have not been well documented, although they're widely recognized among archaeologists and other specialists, genealogists, ethnographers, and even descendant communities themselves. And I'm talking today about Lewis and Elmwood cemeteries in Granville County. I'll provide a little bit of a context for helping to interpret those. And then where I want to get us to today in my few minutes with you is to suggest ways that these can be incorporated into broader preservation efforts. In Granville County, this is just an area I happen to be working in. This could be any county in North Carolina, but particularly in any county that historically had a large enslaved population. I suspect that the patterns that I'm talking to you about today are relevant in all those other areas as well. But for reference, Granville County is on the North Carolina-Virginia border in north central North Carolina. It's along the Roanoke River Valley, which is rich, fertile farmland. And beginning in the 18th century, there was an influx of wealthy, elite Virginia planters who went on to establish vast land holdings in this area, but by focusing primarily on tobacco as a cash crop. And it shouldn't be a surprise to any of us who work in this area that required a large enslaved labor force, unfortunately. So I want to leave you, just share one statistic with you that in 1860, in Granville County, there were 1,006 enslavers, which was the second largest number in the state of North Carolina. At the same time, there were 11,086 enslaved individuals, which was the first in the state. So Granville County is probably one of the best examples to talk about African American cemeteries because of that, simply the sheer number of enslaved individuals who lived during that period. A couple of historic maps here that I want to provide for context and explain why these are important for anyone who's researching old cemeteries. On the left is a map from 1868 of Granville County. On the right is from 1895, and then one in the middle is from 1935. And the circle that I've added there shows the locations of Elmwood Cemetery, but it's also very close to Lewis Cemetery. But these maps are really important because they provide landmarks, they provide names that typically associated with white folks, so we keep that in mind, but those may lead us to research that will help us identify where the African American cemeteries are. What we do as archaeologists, and other folks do this as well, is to take these maps and we bring this into a geographic information system today and try to georeference these. That is, we try to place these maps matching current landmarks so that we can then find out where these locations might actually be on the ground today. And this was an important component of the research that I've done so far in Granville. Lewis and Elmwood cemeteries, here's a map, topographic map that shows their location. They're roughly a mile apart, and they both have site numbers as a result of work that my company's done in the last 18 months. I will talk about these individually, but they share a lot of common patterns, so I'll go through that briefly. The Lewis Cemetery, on the left is a map there that we created as a result of an assessment looking at the visible surface expressions and then a systematic probe survey to identify unmarked graves. On the right is is a photograph that shows a general perspective of that cemetery. And each of those pin flags you see is a feature of some sort. It's either a depression or a fieldstone marker of some type, but it gives you a really good sense of what one of these cemeteries looks like. Melissa showed some very good examples of African American cemeteries in various states of preservation or cleanup or how they might appear today. This is a really representative photograph of what these often look like when we come across them archaeologically. In this cemetery, the archival records are ambiguous. There's no clear answer about who this cemetery was actually affiliated with in the antebellum period. Samuel Morton acquired this property in the 1880s, but it's likely that the cemetery was already there. If it was, then it may have been associated with Willis Lewis prior to that time, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. But our mapping showed, and the systematic probing combined, identified 132 unique features here. That includes 80 marked graves and 46 unmarked graves. 94 of those graves have a depression. There are 119 individual fieldstone markers. Many of those are paired with a head and footstone, and you saw some of those in Melissa's presentation as well. And have some photos here in the next slide that will articulate that better. A couple of the graves have funeral home markers. Again, Melissa showed those. And 2 of the graves have mounds too. This slide shows a couple of photographs of Lewis Cemetery. On the photograph on the left is a mounded grave. That tends to be a common feature of African American cemeteries in certain areas. We do see it here. The lower right, there in those red ovals, those are depressions. Even without the ovals, you should be able to see those. They're typically visible. And in the upper right there is one of the funeral home markers that Melissa referenced. There's the placard is gone by this point, but that's fairly typical. We often see those. Elmwood Cemetery, the archival record here is a little bit clearer in terms of its history. This was part of Elmwood Plantation, which was initiated in 1805 by Howell and Willis Lewis. They sold it to William Gregory in the 1820s, and William Gregory was one of the wealthiest planters in all of Granville County. He owned vast land holdings. In 1860, he owned 5,000 acres, or I'm sorry, Elmwood itself was roughly 5,000 acres in size and had as many as 100 enslaved African Americans. And just for context, that's a very, very large plantation historically. That's even for this area, that's a large plantation. Now, I did not do any systematic probing at this cemetery. It was only a visual inspection of surface features, but that survey turned up 108 fieldstone markers, 68 depressions. There were no funeral home markers, and the 68 depressions are a minimum number of individuals. It's likely that there are many more people buried here. And if we were to do a systematic probe survey or even a GPR survey, I'm confident that we would identify additional graves. A couple of photos of Elmwood that similar to what we saw at Lewis. In the lower left is you see it's a good example of the paired headstone and footstone of fieldstone markers along with a depression. The lower right, those are two depressions that don't have any fieldstone markers. They're simply depressions. They may or may not have been marked with temporary markers at some point in the past. And Melissa talked about wooden markers. We know that those are certainly common at certain times and places. I can't say for sure whether or not they existed here, but this is often what we see. And the picture in the top center there is actually what is likely a juvenile grave, in that the distance between the head and footstone is about half the size of what we see in a typical adult grave. So even understanding that and creating a detailed map of a cemetery can provide a lot of information about the demographics of that particular area. And in terms of interpretations, I'll summarize here that some of the shared characteristics between these two cemeteries that we would likely expect to see in other African American cemeteries from the same time period. Again, these are located roughly a mile apart. It's just pure coincidence that my company happened to work at both of these projects at different times, but within 18 months of each other, and that they're in the same general area. It's also just coincidental that they happen to likely be associated with the same white families in the early 19th century. Both cemeteries have a high number of graves. The number of 68 to 70 at Elmwood is a conservative estimate. It's likely much higher than that. The number of 130 at Lewis Cemetery is pretty good. It could be a little above or a little below that. If we conducted a GPR survey, we might be able to refine that. But both of those numbers correlate very well with what we're able to determine from the archival research in terms of the different census and slave schedules at various times, in terms of the number of enslaved people who lived and worked in those plantations during that period. There's extensive use of fieldstone markers, and as Melissa pointed out, there are good reasons for that. It's locally available. Oftentimes folks were not allowed to or didn't have the means to procure other markers, but obviously commemorating their ancestors was important to them, so we see fieldstone markers extensively. Depressions, that's a result oftentimes of the burial container itself has collapsed, and if the descendant community is no longer there, they're not filling the grave any longer, so that's typical of African American cemeteries in these areas. In this case, neither of these cemeteries have any surface decorations or offerings, and I'm actually glad Melissa showed that earlier, because that tends to be confined to the coastal areas of the Carolinas and Georgia, although it does occur else in other places as well, but no evidence of that here. Both cemeteries are located on high ground, and as Melissa pointed out, these were areas that were typically marginal as far as the planter was concerned. In other words, that it wasn't productive for them, so it was reserved for African American use. Again, both of these cemeteries are located in close proximity to water. That likely has some significance. There's a variety of academic research that talks about water as a symbol of journey from life to death, or even the ocean crossing in terms of return to Africa. Almost all the graves have some kind of east-west orientation, although there are variations on that. Particularly at Lewis Cemetery, the variations are a little bit askew in certain clusters, but those clusters likely represent family groupings. And that's another characteristic that we often see in African American cemeteries. Again, there's academic research that suggests that's tied to West African traditions. It also may indicate that there was a lack of any kind of formal oversight of how folks were buried. In other words, it's a much more organic pattern and very typical of African American cemeteries. I'm going to share a couple of slides here just to talk about the kind of research that we use as archaeologists, and particularly in these two cases, how I got to some of the conclusions I arrived at. This is a plat map of Elmwood from 1922, and I'll show the next one as well. It's actually from a different plantation. But these plat maps are publicly available in the Granville County Register of Deeds online, so it does not require a visit to their office to find these, but they're incredibly informative for any genealogists, historians, archaeologists like myself who want to better understand how and where cemeteries are and the broader context for interpreting those. This plot of Elmwood, again, is from 1922. I know you can't see this, but it's roughly 900 acres, and it shows that in 1922 it was being further subdivided. But that 902 acres was a legacy of a former plantation that was thousands of acres in size at one point in time. And I want to give credit here to a colleague of mine, Paul Moeller from the North Carolina Department of Transportation, who himself is an archaeologist, who alerted me about how to bring these maps into GIS that I mentioned earlier and reference these and snap these to current tax parcel maps. And I'll get to that in a minute and show a good example of how that works. This map is from a Hill Area Plantation, which is the adjoining plantation to Elmwood. It's not where Lewis Cemetery is. This is from 1927. But this plantation belonged to Francis Gregory, who was William Gregory's brother. So these two guys both came from Virginia in the early 19th century. They both lived in the same area. They both had large plantations. We're fortunate that there are plat maps from the early 20th century that show the residual sizes of those plantations. And this next slide is one of the most unique I've seen yet in terms of a plat map. This is an inset from the Hill Area map from 1927 that shows what's labeled on the map as a colored graveyard. And of the dozens of plat maps that I've looked at from Granville County specifically, and all the other plat maps I've looked at from in numerous years of research, I have never seen a plat map from this time period that shows an actual African American cemetery on that property. So in trying to draw inferences from that, it tells us that in 1927, that cemetery was visible. It was recognized as a cemetery. It may have been still in use at that time by a local African American community, but it likely extends much further in time. I suspect, although I can't verify this, that it's an antebellum cemetery for enslaved individuals. It would require a visit to document that, and I've not been able to access the property, so I haven't seen it in person. But if I leave you with nothing else, it's just understanding that this kind of plat map is very rare in terms of the detail it provides. So these resources are really valuable for helping to understand African American cemeteries. I'm getting near the end here. I'll close out here in just a couple minutes, but what you see in this map here is those geo-referenced plat maps to scale on a current map. And you can see Elmwood Cemetery and its distance from the Elmwood main house. And then I know you can't see the Hill Area is on the right. That's the other plantation. I have not labeled the African American Cemetery here in this, but even looking at this kind of mapping as an archaeologist tells us a lot about where we might look on the landscape to try to identify additional African American cemeteries. So this is really where I want to end my remarks today, is talking about the National Register of Historic Places. And Melissa touched on this a bit in her presentation as well. The National Register focuses on districts, sites, buildings, objects, and structures that have been considered historically important. This map that I show on the left here is taken directly from the North Carolina State Historic Preservation Office data sets that's publicly available online. I focused on my research just specifically on northern Granville County, but one could look at anywhere in North Carolina and produce the same kinds of results here. There are 28 listings in this area. Of those 28 listings, 23 are for antebellum plantation houses from that plantation era period, 1746 to 1865. In reading through those various nominations, they typically list the main house, which was of course important, or it still is important in some cases. There oftentimes are outbuildings that were associated. There occasionally are tenant houses, although those are rare. And almost never any reference to housing for enslaved individuals unless that housing was subsequently used for a tenant house in some sort. I've yet to see in any of those nominations any mention of an African American cemetery. There may be an occasional reference to the white planter cemetery, but what's important for me to take away from here is that thinking about those statistics I shared in 1860 in terms of The enslaver population was less than 10% of the overall population. The enslaved population was more than 90%. Yet we look at the listings in the National Register today, and almost 100% of listings are for essentially elite white planter residences or white planter properties. There are no listings at all for African American resources in any of Granville County, any of northern Granville County, and certainly not cemeteries. So what I'd like to leave you with is my contention here, and this is what I really want to talk about, or the point I want to make today, is why African American cemeteries are so important. They are typically the only property type that's left associated with the African American experience from this period of time. It's very rare that there's an extant dwelling that's still standing. And as Melissa pointed out, that's a result of sometimes neglect, whether it's benign or intentional. Sometimes it's destruction, or those resources simply haven't been considered important historically. So thinking about the National Register being focused on property, on a property type, a cemetery is the only property type that's left that's associated with African Americans. And they hold the physical remains of thousands of people who comprise the majority of the population, and particularly in Granville County, they compose 90% of the population. There are no records, there are no inscriptions, there are no names. Even in cemeteries that we've looked at, and the two examples I gave here are very good at that, none of those fieldstone markers are inscribed in any way. We don't know who's buried there. We have no idea what their names were. So archaeology may be the only effective way to identify those. What I also want to point out here too is that just looking at those National Register listings for all of those antebellum homes, each one of those comprised an independent plantation at one point in time. They should all have an associated African American cemetery, every one of them. And so one of my goals is, as I work on my own time, is to go out on the landscape and try to work with local citizens who might be knowledgeable of these areas and identify and record more of these. Ultimately, what I'm trying to do, and I've talked to Melissa about this and other folks in the Office of State Archaeology and the Historic Preservation offices, I want to work on a National Register nomination that's a multiple property listing for African American cemeteries, specifically for Granville County. It doesn't mean that it couldn't also be applied elsewhere. I'm confident that it could be, but we have to start somewhere. And so my idea here is that these properties need to be recognized to commemorate the African American experience and their contribution to American history so that we can better tell a more complete story. So with that, I will just close with a couple of acknowledgements. I'd like to thank Barbara Strode, who's the current owner of Elmwood property where the cemetery is located. She took this upon herself to hire us to come out and assess that cemetery. If it weren't for her, we would not have known about that. I'd like to thank Preservation North Carolina for the opportunity to be here today and speak. It's been a real privilege. And Melissa Timo and her colleagues at the Office of State Archaeology, they're always great. I enjoy working with them. And of course, my company, New South, and I will be around for the duration. I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone may have. And with that, I will close. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Shawn. All right, Debra.
Okay, are you?
We're seeing your notes.
Okay. Let me close it out.
You may
Okay,
just
hold
have
on.
to
I'm gonna.
stop
Yeah.
sharing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Is it still perfect?
Yep. We don't see your
Okay.
notes.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you,
you.
Melissa. And thank you for allowing me to be here today. I'm in great company and always glad to talk about Gear Cemetery and the Friends of Gear Cemetery. So I'm going to start out just giving you a little bit of background information about the cemetery and then talk about some of the features of it, the physical, the people, and wrap up with a bit about Friends of Gear Cemetery, you know, how we got to where we are and the things that we're excited about. So Gear Cemetery is located in Durham, North Carolina. It is a post-emancipation cemetery, and the first deed that we have seen giving the land or where African Americans purchased the land was in 1877, and that deed contains three African American men who had been formerly enslaved. Also, at this time, this land was in Orange County and not Durham County. Durham County wasn't formed to 1881. And so so after that, we have also located several other deeds which have a few other names on it, but we always kind of start with this one with John O'Daniel, Nelson Mitchell, and Willis Moore. Okay, the cemetery was used up until about 1930 actively, and it was closed somewhere between 1930 and 1940 by the city for being overcrowded. And that may be a reflection of that, you know, there's always room for one more, but that's only part of the story in that it was one of the few public community type of cemeteries for African Americans. Durham had Maplewood established in 1875, I believe, but African Americans were not allowed to be buried there. So the community worked to create African American cemeteries that they could use because they could not be buried in Maplewood. Okay. We estimate right now that there are over 1,800 burials, probably more than that as the more research that we do, trying to find names. There are no records associated with this cemetery. We suspect because of the multiple deeds that there was some type of organization that was formed, but where the records are, we don't know. So the only places we know where people are buried or where there are currently monuments still existing. There also have been several names to reference this cemetery, Mason Cemetery, the old cemetery, the old city cemetery, the colored cemetery, Furl Road, this cemetery, the road that used to go by it was Furl Road. So we have several names. We're not sure exactly when Gear Cemetery sort of stuck with the name, but that is the name that is used by now. One of the things that excites me about this cemetery is that we know of at least 2 people who are buried in there who have WPA interviews for the slave narratives. And so to me, that's always exciting, one being Millie Markham and the other being Abner Jordan. Okay, we also know that benevolent societies were used to help bury the African American community with their burial. And we see over on the left is a marker from the Odd Fellows, and looking in one of the city directories, there were 3 lodges for the Odd Fellows. We don't know if this was an area that they probably reserved plots that were used by all 3 or just one, we're not sure. And sometimes the connections we make are through newspaper articles, where here we see Jim Lloyd, who had been a part of Trinity College, which predated Duke University, that his burial was going to be handled by both the Odd Fellows and the Masons. And there are quite a few Masons who are in the cemetery also. We see those on the monuments that exist. There's emblems. To also add to why we think there might have been some type of group that was overseeing it is in the city directory, especially in the early 1900s, we do see an overseer. So here are 2 different city directories. One was from around 1910, the other one was 1920 that shows Mr. Gilmore being the overkeeper. And he seems to have been the overkeeper for quite some time and probably right up to his death. We do know too that as the cemetery was becoming crowded, that the African American community were petitioning the city for an extension of a burial ground, a community burial ground for the African American community. So we see in the newspaper, there were articles where they have petitioned for the council meetings. Looking through council minutes, we also know that when the city agreed to have a separate but equal burial ground for African Americans, the African American community requested, well, expand Gear Cemetery. But because of the white neighborhood that was growing around, they petitioned the city like, no, we don't want that there, and they won. So the equal but separate cemetery is in South Durham. It's Beechwood, and that's part of what led to the demise of Gear Cemetery and why at one point you couldn't recognize it as a cemetery. But over here on the very left, I have an 1897 article, which gives us a little glimpse of what the cemetery might have been just 20 years after its finding, in that even then it was quite full. We know that there were a lot of wooden markers, which, as you've heard from both Melissa and Shawn, those are not around anymore. And one of the things in this one that I find quite endearing is there was an epitaph that was written in a newspaper, and unfortunately to this date, I haven't been able to find little John Morgan, and I'm hoping one day to kind of find him. Death certificates weren't started until the early 1900s, I think it was 1908. So if you were deceased before then, unless there was some like Bible record or family record, newspaper article, we really don't have hard dates for when people were deceased. I like to think of Gear Cemetery as a quiet place of beauty. And here is just a fall photo. And right now we know there's approximately 200 headstones that are so far that we are aware of in this cemetery. Okay. So a little bit about the people. And we have people who were like movers and kickers in Durham, North Carolina, very prominent people. We've had the people who supported the infrastructure, the laborers, the bricklayers, the carpenters, the laundress, the nurses, the chauffeurs, all of those. But we also had professional people, doctors, the ministers, the teachers. And we have some that I think are quite famous. A couple that I pulled out here looking at the picture at the top is Augustus Shepard. He was the father of James E. Shepard, who founded North Carolina Central University. But Augustus Shepard also left his marks too. He was a long-term minister at White Rock Baptist Church, and he established an orphanage which still exists in Oxford, North Carolina, for African American children. The middle picture is a picture of Millie Markham. And then the bottom picture is a picture of P.W. Dawkins. He was an educator. He came out of South Carolina. He was educated at Hampton University. He was principal at Kittrell University, and was a teacher at several other places in North Carolina. He went back to South Carolina to the Penn School on St. Helena Island, which is a historical site to this day. And he returned to Durham to be a principal of the colored school in Durham, and he died fairly young. So to me, that represents somebody who moved across their various spaces. He also to me represents the Reconstruction era in which a lot of African Americans made great strides. It wouldn't be fitting if I didn't give you a little bit about John O'Daniel and Nelson Mitchell and Willis Moore, the three men on the first deed. The picture at the right is John O'Daniel. He worked for Julian Carr his entire life. It was said that he is a half brother to Julian Carr, and Julian Carr supported a lot of his endeavors throughout his life. And after John O'Daniel died, the Carr family bought this building, which still exists in Durham, and by then they were into textiles, and they renamed it the John O'Daniel Textile Mill. And they hired only African American workers in there, not just for the janitorial type of jobs, but actually some of the more professional type jobs. Nelson Mitchell was a carpenter. He died in 1921, and both he and John O'Daniel are the only two that were buried in Gear Cemetery. Willis Moore left the Durham area in the early 1900s and went to Arkansas, where he was a very prominent cabinet maker. Okay, now I said both of John O'Daniel and Nelson Mitchell were buried in Gear Cemetery. John O'Daniel was removed out of the cemetery and reburied in Beechwood in the 1930s. But we do believe that Nelson Mitchell still is there. We don't know exactly where, but he is there. Okay, the cemetery has people who had spent time enslaved and people who were born after emancipation. And over on the right is Dulcie Bradshear. Sometimes I see her listed as a Bradshaw. I think she might be one of the I was going to say oldest, but possibly earliest born buried in Gear Cemetery. If you see on the newspaper article, she was 104 years old, which indicates she would have been born around 1795. And her husband, Edward, died just a couple of years before that, and it's very well, he was probably about the same age, so they might be some of the earliest born in the cemetery. Ben Gaddis was another one who died in around the late 1800s, and one of the older people who is buried in, or earliest born buried in Gear Cemetery. And many of the people who were born pre-emancipation came to Durham from the surrounding areas. A large number came from the Stagville plantation, which at one time expanded across several counties, but was one of the largest slave holding plantation, with at one point having over 900 enslaved people. They came from the Lipscomb plantation. They came from surrounding areas, from Granville, from Person County, from Wake County. And so again, because we don't have records, finding these little nuggets in the newspaper gives us an idea of people who were buried in there before the death certificates were available. The cemetery has been cleaned a number of times under different organizations. Some were done in the late right around 1970, 1980 timeframe. But then around the early 2000s, under the leadership of a Durham historian and descendant, Mr. Kelly Bryant, and a community member who lived in the area, Jessica Yurtis, they formed the Friends of Gear Cemetery in the early 2000s. And it really started out as a grassroots organization and focused with kind of cleaning up the cemetery and doing a little bit of research. But as every organization has its ups and downs, Gear Cemetery, the Friends of Gear Cemetery had its downs. So around in December of 2018, the new Friends of Gear Cemetery began to take shape. And our mission was the same as the previous version of restoring and preserving this cemetery. It was that, and preserving the legacy of the people who are buried in there. But we knew that we had to take a different approach, and that we had to be more formal, that we had to grow from a grassroots organization to a more formal organization. We also took the approach that we needed to look before we leap. And so we purposely moved very slow, but then it really got very fast, very quickly. and forming into a 501c3 was to be a little more of a long-term objective for us, but it happened very, very quickly in our time frame, that more quicker than we thought. So I want to point out on this slide, in the bottom right is one of the monuments for a Reverend A.B. Abrams. And I spent a lot of time going around like, has anybody seen a marker like this? Have you seen a marker like this? And experts going, no. It turns out that is a building, a piece or architecture from a building. And I can't remember what it's called. I'm not an architect, so I kind of keep losing that term. But to me, that's kind of like recycling at its best. And it also, I think, might reflect some of what Melissa and Shawn were saying, is to utilize what was available to mark graves at the time. So because it was so unique, as you can see, we've used that as our part of our logo. Okay. So taking our mission statement, and then from that, we developed our 3 taglines: restore, reclaim, respect. And we looked at, okay, how are we going to do this? What are we going to do? And so we've got probably about 6 or 7 different categories that we felt were important to kind of guide us. And one was education of ourselves. We need to learn how to be preservers and how to respectfully handle things in the cemetery. Research, there are a number of us that are got a genealogy or historian background. And so we're very interested in the research of the cemetery, but also the people. We knew we couldn't do this alone, so partnerships and collaborations are necessary to move forward, and then just that whole idea of understanding what preservation is. So we started out with an event that we called a reclamation event, and these are from the photo that you see, and they sort of reflect what our ultimate mission is, and that is to bring the descendants back to their family, to give them the opportunity to come visit their family, something that they had been broken, something they have lost. And so in that reclamation ceremony that we had, on the very left is a headstone that was buried under a couple of inches of dirt. It was laying down. We worked with a monument company, Durham Marble Works. And so in the top picture, you see them setting up the headstone. And then in the center picture is the descendant, who is the grandson and the nephew of the 2 people who that headstone represents. And in talking with this gentleman, asking him, well, did you ever visit? And he can recall he and his aunt coming out to look for the cemetery and not finding it because the brush had overtaken it, nature had overtaken it because the landscape had changed. They didn't know where it was, but here he is almost 30 years later, standing by his grandfather and great uncle and his uncle. We've had a number of challenges as we've moved through this space over the last few years. The first one, I think I've already kind of mentioned, is a lack of experience and knowledge, because we want anybody to come in and help us, but we also want to make sure that we do it appropriately. And that's where my friend Melissa has become my best friend in terms of this, and that we started right out, contacting the state office and taking to heart all of the advice and information that we received. The cemetery is considered abandoned. It is unowned. But then I have people that say, no, all land is owned. And in reality, that's true, because we know we had that deed in 1877. We know of 2 other deeds that followed that added about another 6 to 8 names. So legally, the ownership would fall through those descendants, and you're 5 or 6 generations away, and they don't even know where it existed. So that is always something that we have to think about, is that there's the lack of ownership on it. Reclaiming the physical space. There have been times where others have taken the space, have encroached upon the space. And up in the top right corner, you see where some very large trees were cut down, where a landowner was trying to pretty much claim the space. And they hired Bobcat. They went in, and not only did they take 2 large trees down, they desecrated a number of burial sites. And there's trees, because they were so large, they're very difficult to move. You just can't bring in equipment to move them. They're still there. They've been there for about 2 to 3 years now, and we're still working on trying to find safe way to get those out of the cemetery. Getting descendants involved is a challenge, because people have been disengaged from the space from so long, and so finding descendants and getting them back involved takes a little bit of work. And then just figuring out, what to do about perpetual care, because you can always go in and make a cemetery look good. You can clean it up and then say, pat yourself on the back, walk away. And in about 5 to 10 years, you're back where you started, if you don't have any kind of perpetual type of care set up for it. Just a few more photos of the challenges, where you can see there was a shed built on what turned out to be a part of the property. At some point, there was a survey done on that side, and you could probably kind of see the rope line going through, and that shed was clearly at one point was built right on top of the cemetery. The success we had, and I guess a lot of it comes with the more that we talk about these spaces and why these cemeteries are important, that type of thing, it really gets people motivated to do the right thing. So this spring, the shed was taken down, and the middle picture shows a piece of when it was coming down, and the bottom picture, it's completely gone. But after every storm, there is a calm. That tree that you see there is a tree that is still sitting from the cut down that we're trying to move, that desecrated several burial sites. But these type of things sometimes bring energy and motivation to the group. And every time we go out there, it serves as a reminder of why we do what we do. In a sense, the energy brings success. Okay. I mentioned that the reason we can accomplish what we do is through partnerships. And so we've worked hard to build a number of partnerships, whether they are state sites like the Stagville, because we do know a number of the people came out of that plantation. Keep Durham Beautiful has been a long-term partner, and so has Preservation Durham. We have the city of Durham. We finally have a working relationship with them. They come out quarterly and help us with some of the weed control and getting some of the heavy brush out. Also working with things like the Durham History Hub to put things out there about the cemetery to keep the public informed. But probably one of our most important partners is our Durham community. And again, some photos to give you an idea. Some of the things that are going on. There's a cleanup day. Keep Durham Beautiful helps to organize the cleanup. That's what they are experts in. So we don't reinvent the wheel. We just work through them. We've had fraternal groups and school groups who've come out to help do cleanup. We've even had Boy Scouts to come do their Eagle Scout projects. The latest one was that sign that was put up there by a Boy Scout about a year ago. The North Carolina State Extension Master Gardeners group came out and beautified the entrance where we have the sign, the Gear Cemetery, and the three pictures you can see is the one at the top left was when the sign was first put up, and the bottom left was an attempt to kind of, give it some beauty. And the third one on the right is the one from the other week when the Master Gardeners came out and did some cleanup and put some nice blooming plants out there. And they are committed to coming back and helping us to maintain that. Okay. Tours with community groups and students. We will organize tours with groups, either whether they are community groups like the Buffalo Soldier Motorcycle Club that came out the other week, or students from Duke University, which we've had also built a relationship with both Duke and North Carolina Central University. We actually partnered with Duke University about 2 years ago, and one of our board members had a class, and part of the class was a service project with Gear Cemetery. And from that experience, one of the students wrote a very thought-provoking poem. And this is just a very small section of that poem. She utilized the names of the people who were buried in there and then put that as part of her narrative into her poem. Last year, when everybody was with the pandemic, we were busy. We went online, we went virtual, we had exhibits, we had virtual sessions such as this, but one of the big ones we had was called In Plain Sight, which was an outdoor exhibit where we've got some funding from the North Carolina Humanities Council. And we produced 10 panels that looked similar to this. This is one of them along the economic life. Each one had a different theme. And those panels were placed throughout the cemetery on temporary holders. We had guided tours, keeping in mind social distancing and all of that, but because it was outdoors, people could come on their own and read the panels and get a feel for the cemetery and the historical value of it and the people that were a part of the Durham community and their contributions. And this panel, the panels, we still have the website up in plain sight, is still available, and all 10 panels are on that in PDF form, so you can see them. Okay, I already mentioned that we've had programs. We started out with in-person programs. There's our respiration awareness ceremony where we had the headstone set up for the Purefoy family. We did some panel discussions that were in person, and then we went to online type of things, events and programs. The Duke's class that took your cemetery as a service project, each student did some research on a person in there, and we had what we call the Histories of Dignity, which was our first online experience, because the day that they were going to do it, we were planning to be in the cemetery was when all the COVID restrictions happened. So we very quickly made it a virtual type of session where the students read their stories. Okay. We also stay true to the ancestors and the integrity of the cemetery. At the very top, for a long time at the Pearson family plot, there was this place sitting. It has been removed. The candle is still there, but apparently there are some families that are coming out there and they are leaving things for their family members or some type of memorials and things. And I know Melissa had mentioned that we haven't seen a lot. That's about the only one we see, and that's recent. It's fairly recent. A couple of times we've had a libation ceremony. The libation ceremony is an African American tradition, and it's a way to honor the ancestors. So that's what's going on in the left column. And the day that particular ceremony was done, a group was out there, family group was out there to honor one of their family members which would have been her 100th, wait a minute, I think this is a 200th birthday. And it just so happened that some students were out there doing some surveying and they got to witness that too. One of the things that has happened to us recently is we've been featured in a number of articles and various forms of media. The BBC, the New Yorker sort of kicked us off. We have a really nice article in the New Yorker magazine that's still online. It was in the October issue. We've actually recently have had a WTVD reporter come out there and do a short segment on that. The NBC on their online blog type page, they've got a nice article, The Growing Movement to Save Black Cemeteries. So that one features a lot of different cemeteries, and Gear Cemetery is one of them. But this is one of the things that has, given us excitement. Along with the number of grants that we've been working to get and have received. One is a fairly sizable one that we're hoping soon to have an archaeological survey done to determine where these grave sites are. Other than right now, some we can tell, as you've heard, through depressions, through the monuments, but still there's a lot more to be discovered. Okay, how to contact us. Visit our Facebook page. One of the things we do on our Facebook page is if we know the birth date of someone, we have a day of honor post where we write up a short story about that person and post it on the day of their birth date. Sometimes there's some other stories that don't follow that particular guideline that are out there. There's our email address. And we're working on our website. It is under construction. You can get to it, but do keep in mind that it is under construction. And that's where we're going to put as many stories as we can. We have developed a core of volunteers to help us do the research and write the some type of genealogy story or biography of the person. So we're putting that on the website. We've actually have a couple of databases that have been put together through other groups like Jewish students and things like that. One of them is a monument database where you can look at the various monuments and do filters. And another one is based on information that we've collected out of death certificates. We hope that you will come to visit us at some point. We would love to show you around. Contact us through the email, the Facebook, and we can arrange, a guided tour. We're always eager to have people come out and visit. We're always eager for any other type of support that people are willing to give. So thank you. And I'll turn it over to Julianne.
Thank you, Deborah. And I did put the Forensic Gear Facebook page as well as the In Plain Sight online exhibit. Both of those are linked in the follow-up email that everyone will receive. So finally, we have Chris DeVore joining us to talk about the African American Burial Grounds Preservation Act. Hi, Chris.
Thanks, Julianne, and thanks everyone for having me today. I'm Christopher DeVore with the Office of Congresswoman Alma Adams. She represents North Carolina's 12th District, Charlotte, North Carolina, in Mecklenburg County. So Congresswoman Adams, this is a very important issue for her. And so she's introduced this year the African American Burial Grounds Preservation Act. This bill provides novel funding, creating a new program at the National Park Service, a new $3 million program that would provide grant funding as well as technical assistance to support historic preservation groups, educational institutions, private nonprofit organizations, and other public entities to preserve these burial sites. We're happy to report that this bill has been endorsed by over 45 organizations across the nation, including different archaeological preservation and other historical societies. So we're hopeful that this bill is a great first step towards providing the necessary funding to preserve these burial sites. Again, the bill is HR 6805. We've introduced that with our friend Rep. McKeechin from Virginia and Rep. Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania. So it is a bipartisan bill. And we were able to secure Senator Sherrod Brown's support as well as Senator Mitt Romney's support in introducing the Senate companion, that's S3667. And so both bills are bipartisan, that's bicameral, and we're hoping that you'll be able to keep this conversation going. Call your representatives, call your senators, tell them to endorse and support this bill, because that's how we're going to get it through to the House floor, to the vote, and to President Biden's desk. So I'm happy to answer any questions, but I really do appreciate you having me here to be able to talk about and elevate this very important piece of legislation.
Thank you so much, Christopher. And there's information about that bill as well in the follow-up email, along with a call to action with some key points for if you do call your members of Congress, what to say, what to ask them for, but really just a way to kind of keep this going and support it down the line. So with that, I will get into a couple questions. So the first question, I'll ask this to Melissa, but someone asked, are there established ways to protect these cemeteries on private land in perpetuity, akin to a conservation easement, but with the intent of preserving history?
There are things in the statutes that allow for money to be left with the county. I don't remember the statute off the top of my head, but I would, the issue usually comes from the fact that cemeteries of all types, especially smaller cemeteries, are sort of left within the broader deed of a property, which becomes problematic because sometimes the fact that the cemetery exists sort of doesn't get transferred over to the next deed. And so one thing family might consider doing is outparceling the cemetery from our surrounding property. That way there is a way to have on multiple records that this is in fact a cemetery. Then from there, I often recommend people establishing an endowment, because there isn't other than leaving money with the county does not have an obligation to then take that money and then do something with it. It's there to be used by the family or whatever group to take it and use it themselves. And so an endowment might be the best way to ensure that the funds are always there. There are no grants for landscaping. That's most of the grants, including the acts that will hopefully be passed very soon. They usually cover things like research and preservation. So if you're looking for something like Debra talked about with their struggles at Gear to make sure that there's long-term care, that would require something like an endowment to keep that going. So there's not a statutory trigger for that type of action right now.
A question from Belle Long for Christopher. Maybe it's just a broader question about the act and how it will be used, but how many cemeteries will $3 million support?
So the program would be established at the National Park Service, and so that would be at the discretion of the secretary in consultation with several different preservation groups, along with Black history leaders in how to disperse the funds on an annual basis. And so I'm not able to speak to how many cemeteries, but it's a good start, and certainly we're looking to see how we can grow that pot of money in the future. But the first step is to getting this bill passed so we can create that initial grant program.
Great, thank you.
Julianne, can I just follow up on Christopher's comment? I can't specify either, but what I can say from the kind of work that we do at New South is even a small amount of $5,000 can do a lot for a cemetery. It might get a GPR survey, it might get a marker inventory, it might get a marker map. It can't do all of those. So if you do the math on that, I can't do that quickly in my head, 3 million divided by 5,000, but that could have a very, very outsized impact and produce a lot of positive benefits for a lot of different cemeteries, that kind of money.
And some of, no, I'm not muted. And some of these as well, the sort of benefit of cemeteries is that most of them are not going to get up and walk away. So even if what happens with some other federal grants that are run through the Park Service called certified local government grants is you put in money to do, say, like a GPR survey of the entire cemetery, but they only have so much money available to disperse across the United States. And so you go in there with the effort in mind, the goal in mind to get the whole thing done. But in the meanwhile, you also say that I will high prioritize this boundary because that's the boundary that's sort of in question, where the burials stop, and there's a neighbor that's not very cooperative on the far side. So you can do bits and pieces as well. Like this it may not fully restore every African American cemetery that exists, but it is hopefully just the beginning of a program like this, and it will do, like Shawn's saying, a lot more good than you might think.
One of the benefits I see from the field that this bill, and it's not related to the grants, but it is the registration of these burial grounds. Because so often they're unknown and there's no centralized place that they are maintained. So that is one of the things that the bill should create, is a database of African American burial grounds.
And a question for Shawn, is the data gathered from a GPR survey worth the cost? And are you aware of any grants that have paid for such surveys in the past? And for those that GPR is ground penetrating radar, and maybe Shawn, you can talk about that a little more.
Sure, Melissa can talk about the grant side of that better than me. There are some, but Melissa knows the details better than me. On the face of it, the answer is yes, but it depends on what your goals are. And then also depends on the conditions in a particular cemetery. In other words, is it completely overgrown or is it heavily wooded? Can it be cleared? What kind of soil is it? How old are the graves? There are lots of factors that influence how successful a GPR survey is. It doesn't mean that the technology can't do it. It certainly can, and experienced operators like myself can do it well, but there are limits to how informative it can be. So what we try to do when we're working with folks is to walk through and be honest about what GPR can and can't do. And if after that conversation, those folks still want to proceed, understanding those limitations, then yes, the outcome is almost always good in terms of at least providing some kind of data about the number of graves that might be there and what are the boundaries of that particular cemetery. Melissa, do you want to take the grant side of that, please?
Yeah, there are more grants for this than for, like, landscaping stuff. There's even more grants for education-based stuff because you can leach out of the historic preservation field and into regular education grants. But there are a number of federal and there are state opportunities or state level opportunities there's a number of things that if you email me, we can work to see which would be the best avenue for you, because it also depends on who owns the property. Does the property owner approve of this happening? Are you doing this as an individual / family, or are you a nonprofit or tied to an organization? That changes grant source availability, because some really want to tie in with some sort of an organization or a 501c3 nonprofit in order to disperse the money, because grants are, as you can imagine, very highly competitive. And so you want to make sure you're in a position and have a plan for a grant activity that has all of your I's dotted, all of your T's crossed, so that you have your highest chance of getting it. And I'm definitely willing to talk to people to talk about feasibility and what type of grant and what the order of operations, because sometimes there are other things that need more attention first, like in the Geer Cemetery and many others. You might want to save your money not for gear, not for GPR, but for trees. Trees are very destructive and really expensive to handle. So we can talk about best practices moving forward, but there are grants out there.
Great. So since we're at 5:30 now, I'll wrap up one final question, and I'm going to combine two, which is that both these questions that get to the issue of property ownership and the fact that a lot of the cemeteries, especially the ones that Shawn was pointing out, of enslaved communities, are often on these larger antebellum, formerly plantations. So how do you balance the public awareness of remote cemeteries, so such as those included on a map, and security, as well as do you find resistance, hesitation, or discomfort from white owners of land with enslaved grave communities?
Well, that registry of sites that I talked about is not publicly accessible. We're looking at perhaps one day being able to put a list of the names of the places, but the registry of sites are held securely because possible private property, but also the fact that these are human remains. And there are some people that aren't great that live in the world. And so we want to make sure to protect these places. And that's also something that I talk to people, like I talked to Debra's group and many other groups about site security and what does that mean. But as far as landowners go, it's really sort of, Shawn could probably talk about this too, sort of a mixed bag. We have some people who are super stoked about this sort of story happening right in their own backyards. And there are other people who are concerned about property values. There are people that are weirded out about the potential ghosts in their backyard. I think there's a full gamut of responses, but I have gotten a number of people who have reached out to me who they are white folk, saying, I bought this property, I think it's this. How do I make sure that it's registered somewhere? So I think the tides are turning, but Shawn could probably talk about this too, that you get the whole suite of reactions.
Yeah, I want to add from a preservation group that works on air and being connected with others, it is a balancing act, and it can go either way. I am aware of horror stories in terms of working with a white landowner for a slave cemetery and trying to restore it. And then I've seen it on the other end too, where people are very open and willing to work. So it kind of goes both ways with that. And then there is still, because even with Gear Cemetery, when we started, there was some concern in security. And once we start, really advertising this, and we've only had one very, very small incident, which was very minor, but some other areas we, especially as we are looking in Durham at some of the other areas, we're not being very vocal about them just yet until we know that they are secure, because there are some people who don't respect those legacies and that these are remains of people and do not so good things. So I think it is a balance.
I'll just add 2 quick points. So those are all great comments. I agree with everything that Melissa and Debra said. Two points I'll make. One is a lot of the work that we do at New South is with private citizens, nonprofits, but also developers who have some kind of development. And in many cases, they're not, I won't say that they're happy that they have a cemetery, but in most cases, they acknowledge the cemetery, they acknowledge its importance, they don't want to disturb it. What they really want to know is what are its boundaries so that they can avoid it. Now, I'm not saying that's the best preservation outcome, but it's better than it being destroyed. So what we find ourselves oftentimes is educating those people about the importance of those resources, about whether or not there's federal money or permitting involved. There are state laws that Melissa's pointed out that apply. We really want to educate those folks about why it's important to recognize and preserve those resources. And typically, in my experience, they do that. Occasionally, one time in 100, yeah, there's a bad actor who wants to do something nefarious. We don't work with those folks, or we advise them of the consequences if they choose to move forward in that kind of path. In terms of how, Melissa, I'm sorry, Julian, your question was how do white folks react? Again, it's across the spectrum. Again, I feel like it's an education. We try to work with those folks to help them understand why that resource is so important and to help tell a story, and hopefully they become a steward of that. Not everyone agrees or wants to acknowledge that, but that's part of our mission, is to help educate people about why these things are so important. So I'll leave it at that.
And there are state statutes, like, again, not just protecting vandalism, but does protect the right of access, reasonable access to visit these places, especially if you're a descendant. General Statute 65-101 and 65-102 are both statutes that you have to work with the landowner, because again, this is private property, but there is legal protections to make sure. And that's what I talk to developers, when I talk to real estate agents, when I talk to people who buy a property and surprise cemetery in the back corner, I always tell them, be aware, regardless of who is buried in that cemetery, that there is a potential for people to come and visit. So have that in your head now, because it may happen, it may not happen, but these are places where, especially as genealogy is becoming such a big hobby, somebody might come to your door and knock. So it's best to develop a plan now. Have a path that you would prefer people to travel on. Have you don't want machinery back there. Have an idea of, this Saturdays in the spring are no good because we have birthday parties every weekend. But we talk to them. That's what our role also as the state, because we do get a lot of the projects that Shawn's involved with, is that we put in these mitigation plans, these avoidance strategies, these inadvertent discovery plans, these access strategies are all built in already into the process. Sometimes it's just the connecting to the right people like me, or other people that work for the state, to figure out who you could talk to make some things happen, or to encourage people to allow things to happen.
Thank you all so much. This has been such a great collaboration, and I feel like we've covered, well, we literally have covered the gamut: national, state, regional, local level. So I just wanted to close and say that I've definitely heard the argument before. I mean, I work for Preservation NC. People associate preservation with just buildings and houses, and I've definitely heard the argument before that preservation can't encompass everything. We should just focus on the buildings and the houses. But I think, and what I hope that this presentation has kind of shown everybody is, what do you do when the buildings associated with a community don't exist, either because of intentional destruction through urban renewal, or maybe they've gone through so many changes over the years that they don't have the integrity to be eligible for the National Register. Shawn's remark about the disparity in representation in the National Register, looking at the number of properties that are on the National Register versus the historical population is a real issue that we as preservationists will have to grapple with if we're going to tell a full and honest story of our country's history. So I really appreciate everyone joining us today. There's lots of links and other resources that will be in your follow-up email, but definitely reach out if you have more questions, comments, and thank you to everyone. Thank you to all of our panelists, especially.
Thank
Have a
you.
good night. Bye.